On a humid evening in late June, Sheriff David Holt sat in the dim light of his study, leafing through the lab results his doctor had sent him. His hands trembled slightly as he read the diagnosis again. HIV positive. David leaned back, stunned. He hadn't engaged in any behavior that could explain this. His mind raced, replaying years of faithful marriage. The only possible source, he realized with growing horror, was Marissa. Later that night, when Marissa returned from her late shift, David confronted her. She initially denied everything, but as David pressed, her mask slipped. Under pressure, Marissa confessed. Months ago, she had been having an affair, not with one man, but with multiple partners she had met through online forums. She admitted she had known about her infection for several weeks, but had been too terrified to tell him. David sat motionless, absorbing the betrayal. As a sheriff, he'd seen the worst of people, but he never imagined his own home would become a crime scene of secrets. Over the next few days, David's demeanor shifted to the townspeople. He was still the calm, dependable sheriff inside. He was a man unraveling, struggling between his duty to uphold the law and the raw need for revenge. He began secretly tailing Marissa after work, his instincts as an investigator overriding his emotions as a husband. The days that followed the confrontation were a study in quiet implosion. David moved through his shifts with robotic precision, patrolling the streets of Crestwood as though nothing had changed. But in the late hours, when the town was still, he would sit in his parked cruiser, watching Marissa's movements from a distance. It was during one of these late-night vigils that David first noticed a pattern. Marissa wasn't staying late at the hospital, as she claimed. Twice a week, she met a man in an unassuming corner of a neighboring town's parking lot, a place far enough away that no one from Crestwood would recognize her. The man, a fitness instructor named Eric Sloan, was younger, athletic, and obliviously affectionate. David took photos from a distance, his hands steady despite the growing rage boiling beneath the surface. Each click of the camera was a slow shattering of the life David thought he knew. But it wasn't just Eric. A deeper dive into Marissa's online life, using resources David knew how to exploit, revealed a devastating pattern. Dozens of secret conversations, hotel bookings, cash transactions. David wasn't just dealing with a wife who had cheated. He was dealing with a woman who had lived a double life right under his nose. He confronted her again late one night, slamming the printed evidence onto the kitchen table. Marissa broke down, crying hysterically, insisting it was a phase, a search for validation after years of feeling unseen. She begged for forgiveness, falling to her knees. But David, hollow and expressionless, simply turned away. The man who had once sworn an oath to protect and serve now felt the dangerous pull of cold, methodical vengeance. At work, his deputies noticed a change. David was quicker to anger, less patient. One night, after breaking up a bar fight, Deputy Tom Weller pulled him aside and asked if everything was all right. David brushed it off with a forced smile. But inside, something dark was germinating, a plan that would stain Crestwood in ways no one could anticipate. The third week after his diagnosis, David's world narrowed to two obsessions: maintaining his facade and monitoring Marissa's movements. Each encounter he witnessed between her and Eric, every lingering touch, every stolen kiss in the shadows, fed the growing monster inside him. Deputy Weller's concern turned into whispered conversations among the department. David's once calm leadership had twisted into volatility. He barked orders, handed out harsh reprimands for small mistakes, and once threw a coffee mug across the office when a report was misplaced. The men under his command learned to keep their distance. At home, Marissa continued her campaign of healing, acting as though repentance could erase reality. She cooked his favorite meals, left handwritten notes tucked into his uniform pockets, and clung to him desperately whenever he entered a room. "You have to forgive me," she whispered one night, gripping his arm. "It doesn't have to destroy us." David stared at her without speaking, feeling a deep, hollow disgust he couldn't voice. In another life, in another circumstance, he might have tried. But now, every word from her mouth sounded like a knife twisting deeper. Driven by a grim sense of necessity, David began tracking Eric Sloan's habits. It was disturbingly easy. Eric was a creature of routine. Early morning workouts at a local gym, mid-afternoon personal training sessions, evening meetings with Marissa. No caution, no awareness. It infuriated David how casually Eric inserted himself into the life David had built, how obliviously he moved through the days. One night, sitting alone in the dark of his garage, David finally allowed himself to imagine what he had refused to until now: killing. It came not as a violent explosion, but a quiet, measured thought. A plan, unfolding with the same slow deliberation he had once used to outsmart criminals. David wasn't rash. He knew impulsive violence would only destroy what little remained of him. If he acted, it would have to be clean, final, something that could be justified, if not in the courts, then in his own collapsing moral compass. The following morning, David called in sick for the first time in years. It wasn't illness that kept him from work, but preparation. He began pulling together the tools he would need: a backup weapon unregistered in departmental logs, disposable gloves, a car no one in Crestwood would recognize. And he began watching not just Marissa, but Eric with a hunter's patience. The first real seeds of a double tragedy had been planted. The days blurred together in a haze of routine and rage. To the townspeople, David remained a constant, a reliable presence at council meetings, a reassuring figure at school crossings. But inside, he was hollow, the rituals of his life now serving as little more than camouflage. Eric Sloan remained predictably oblivious. David watched from a distance as Eric flirted openly with women at the gym, laughing loudly, flashing the same easy charm he once must have used on Marissa. David wasn't sure what infuriated him more, Eric's betrayal or his carelessness. In David's mind, both were crimes deserving of punishment. At home, Marissa kept up her desperate act, layering their home with apologies and artificial normalcy. One evening, she presented David with a small, wrapped box. Inside was a leather-bound notebook embossed with his initials, a supposed symbol of new beginnings. David nodded stiffly and placed it in a drawer without a word. Marissa's face crumbled, but David felt nothing. He began preparing in earnest. A secondary vehicle, an old, battered Ford pickup he had quietly purchased in a neighboring county, was parked 2 towns over. Cash payments ensured there would be no paper trail. The weapon he selected was a clean revolver, not his service weapon, and it remained hidden in a lockbox under the false floor of the truck bed. David's plan wasn't impulsive. He intended to wait for the right night, the right circumstances, something that would allow the confrontation to appear chaotic, unplanned. A burglary gone wrong, perhaps. A road rage incident. Something plausible enough to raise questions but not immediate suspicions. He attended Eric's gym under a fake name, observing his habits from within. Eric, true to form, hardly noticed him. David's anger crystallized into a frighteningly serene acceptance. Eric was a parasite, feeding off the destruction of other people's lives without consequence. It wasn't just personal anymore. In David's mind, it was justice. Marissa remained the other half of the equation. At times, David would catch her staring at him across the dinner table, her eyes red and exhausted, her mouth moving in soundless apologies. She was unraveling too, but unlike David, she had no plan, no endgame, only fear. David wondered briefly if that fear was punishment enough, but the thought never lasted long. On a warm Friday evening, as Marissa left for another late shift, David followed her one final time. He watched as she pulled into a cheap motel on the edge of town, her car parking beside Eric's. No more doubt, no more planning. The timeline had begun. Saturday morning broke heavy with humidity, the kind that made the streets of Crestwood feel close and suffocating. David rose early, running through the motions of normal life. He shaved carefully, brewed coffee, and kissed Marissa absently on the forehead as she pretended to sleep. Neither of them mentioned the night before. Neither needed to. He drove to the department, logging a few administrative hours to maintain appearances. His deputies, sensing his volatility, but unaware of its cause, kept a respectful distance. David filled out paperwork, signed off on a few reports, and cracked forced jokes at the water cooler. The perfect performance of a man holding his life together. By mid-afternoon, David made his move. He texted Deputy Weller that he was heading out of town for personal reasons, invoking the sheriff's autonomy that rarely demanded explanation. Weller didn't push. It was a small town. Secrets lived just under the surface. David was confident no one would question him, at least not immediately. Changing into jeans and a plain sweatshirt, he retrieved the old Ford pickup from where it was parked outside a friend's abandoned farm property. He slipped on disposable gloves and wiped down the steering wheel, gear shift, and door handles. No mistakes. No DNA traces. The revolver rested heavy in the glove box, its cold steel a silent reassurance. David had run through the plan 100 times in his mind. It would happen cleanly. Intercept Eric when he left the motel after meeting Marissa. A simple confrontation, words, perhaps a shove, escalating naturally into fatal violence. He would ensure it appeared spontaneous, driven by emotion, not careful orchestration. Around dusk, David parked near the motel, the truck angled so that he could watch the entrance without drawing attention. His heartbeat was steady, unnaturally so. He was past rage now, past heartbreak. There was only inevitability. Time stretched painfully slow. Cars came and went, couples laughing too loud, a teenager throwing rocks at a lamppost. But eventually, David saw what he was waiting for. Marissa slipping out the side door first, looking hurried, guilty. She didn't notice the truck, didn't look around. Seconds later, Eric followed, adjusting his jacket casually, whistling a tune. David exhaled slowly, gripping the steering wheel so tightly the veins in his hands stood out. His pulse thrummed in his ears, but his mind remained eerily clear. Not yet. He needed the right moment, isolated, away from potential witnesses. He followed Eric's car at a distance as he drove out of town, oblivious. They traveled for almost 20 minutes before Eric pulled into a deserted gas station, the kind that looked abandoned after dark. Perfect. David parked down the street, retrieved the revolver, tucked it into the waistband of his jeans, and approached on foot, keeping to the shadows. Eric leaned against his car, scrolling casually through his phone, utterly exposed. David moved closer. 5 feet away now. The weight of the coming act settled on him, final and absolute. It was time. The night wrapped around the empty gas station like a shroud. A single flickering bulb buzzed above the storefront, casting long, broken shadows across the cracked asphalt. The hum of insects was the only sound. David closed the final distance with deliberate calm. Eric, still glued to his phone, didn't notice him until it was too late. By the time Eric looked up, David was standing directly in front of him, hand casually resting inside the waistband of his sweatshirt. Eric blinked, puzzled. "Hey man, need something?" David didn't speak. Instead, he slowly pulled the revolver free, raising it level with Eric's chest. The confusion on Eric's face morphed into horror as he instinctively backed up against his car. "Wait! Wait!" Eric stammered, hands raised. For a brief second, David hesitated. The world seemed to hang in suspension, heavy with the weight of an irreversible decision. Somewhere deep inside, a voice, small, broken, asked if he really wanted to go this far. Then he remembered the test results. Marissa's betrayal, Eric's casual laughter outside the motel. The shot rang out, sharp and brutal, tearing through the heavy night. Eric stumbled, clutching his side, his mouth opening in a silent scream. Another shot, then another. David moved forward mechanically, firing until Eric collapsed against the side of his car and slid to the ground, leaving a smear of dark blood on the metal. David stood over the body for a moment, breathing heavily. His ears rang from the noise, but beneath the adrenaline was an eerie calm. No panic, no remorse, only the clinical awareness that step 1 was complete. He wiped the revolver clean with a rag, retrieved the shell casings, and pocketed them. He checked Eric's pulse. Gone. Quickly, methodically, he rifled through Eric's pockets, removing anything identifying. Wallet, phone, gym membership card. He dumped them into a plastic bag he carried in his jacket. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was enough. This wouldn't look like a targeted execution. It would look like a robbery gone wrong at a gas station miles from town, in a place where police presence was minimal and surveillance non-existent. David returned to the truck, peeled off the gloves, and drove off slowly, careful not to draw attention. He tossed the gloves and bag into a dumpster behind a closed diner on the way back to Crestwood. By the time he got home, Marissa was already in bed, pretending to sleep. David watched her from the doorway for a long moment, the gun still tucked against his lower back, the echoes of the gunshots still vibrating inside him. One down. One to go. Morning broke gray and heavy over Crestwood. David sat in the kitchen, his coffee growing cold in his hand, staring blankly out the window. Marissa moved around the house in a state of nervous energy, sensing the change but not daring to ask questions. The news came mid-morning. A body had been found at a gas station off Route 17. Male, shot multiple times. No immediate identification. Deputy Weller delivered the information casually, not suspecting for a moment that their own sheriff might have any connection to the case. David nodded grimly, feigning concern. "Bad stretch of road," he said. "No cameras out there. Gonna be tough." Inside, he felt nothing. Eric Sloan was now just a headline, a statistic. But Marissa, she remained a living, breathing reminder of every humiliation, every betrayal. And unlike Eric, her guilt was more complex. She had been his partner, his wife. She had vowed loyalty and delivered a death sentence instead. That evening, David suggested they have dinner together, just the two of them, like they used to. Marissa's face lit up with something like hope, though wariness still flickered behind her eyes. She agreed instantly, eager for any chance at reconciliation. David reserved a table at Miller's Creek, a quiet steakhouse just outside town where the lights were low and the booths were secluded. As they sat down, David was the perfect picture of polite indifference. He let Marissa talk, about work, about town gossip, her words tumbling out nervously, trying to fill the vacuum between them. Finally, David set his fork down and looked at her, the polite smile fading. "Tell me," he said, voice low. "How long were you going to keep lying?" Marissa's hands trembled slightly. "David, I made mistakes. But I was scared. I didn't know how to tell you." "You knew exactly what you were doing," he said, his voice flat. "You didn't stop, even after you knew you were sick." Tears welled in her eyes. The surrounding tables faded away in David's mind. It was just the two of them, two people sitting at the center of a slow, burning wreckage. "I'm sorry," she whispered, reaching across the table for his hand. David let her touch him, let her believe, for one fleeting moment, that forgiveness was possible. He squeezed her fingers gently, meeting her tearful gaze. Inside, he made his decision. It wouldn't happen here, in public, not yet, but soon. The dinner ended quietly. David paid in cash, tipping generously, thanking the server with a smile. He led Marissa back to the truck, hand resting lightly on her back, the way a husband might guide his wife after a pleasant evening. On the way home, Marissa leaned her head against the window, her breath fogging the glass. She looked small, fragile. For a moment, David almost faltered. Almost. But then he remembered the clinic, the doctor's tight, uncomfortable tone, the diagnosis that had detonated his life. There would be no faltering. Later, lying awake beside her in bed, David stared at the ceiling. The revolver rested on the nightstand beneath a folded towel, unseen but very present. The next move would be his. The next day passed in excruciating slowness. David moved carefully, giving no indication of what churned beneath his calm exterior. At the sheriff's department, he processed mundane paperwork, checked in briefly with the mayor's office, and gave Weller a few half-hearted instructions about ongoing cases. No one suspected a thing. Back home, Marissa hovered nervously. She seemed desperate to seize on the fragile thread of hope she thought last night's dinner had given her. She suggested a weekend away, just the two of them. A cabin near Pine Hollow Lake, a place they used to visit early in their marriage, back when things had still felt innocent. David agreed without hesitation. In fact, he suggested they leave that evening. Marissa, visibly relieved, busied herself packing overnight bags, humming a shaky tune under her breath as she moved around the bedroom. David packed light, a few changes of clothes, a hunting knife, a roll of duct tape, and the revolver, carefully hidden beneath a pile of folded shirts. If she noticed the tension in his movements, she didn't say anything. The drive to the cabin was silent at first, tension stretching between them like a tight wire. But as the miles passed, Marissa began to relax, filling the silence with small talk about town gossip and tentative plans for the future. David let her talk, his responses mechanical. Outwardly, he was the picture of a tired husband trying to rebuild. Inside, he was counting down the minutes. They arrived at the cabin just after sunset. The small wooden structure sat alone at the edge of the woods, the lake beyond it reflecting the last light of the dying day. It was isolated, no neighbors for miles, and the old landline phone inside hadn't worked in years. Cell service was spotty at best. Perfect. Marissa bustled around, unpacking groceries and lighting a fire, her movements quick and nervous. She was trying so hard to believe in the illusion of their recovery that she didn't notice David's growing detachment. They ate a quiet dinner, sandwiches and beer, sitting across from each other in the dim light of the fire. David watched her, studying her movements, her expressions. He wondered if she could feel it yet, the finality closing in around her. Later, Marissa suggested they sit by the lake like they used to. David agreed. They walked down to the shoreline together. The air was cool and the trees whispered softly in the dark. Marissa wrapped her arms around herself and leaned into David, resting her head against his shoulder. "I've missed this," she said softly. "I've missed us." David looked out over the still water, his jaw tight. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." For a moment, they stood in silence. Then David gently pulled away. "Stay here," he said. "I'll grab another blanket." Marissa smiled, hugging herself against the chill. David walked back toward the cabin, his steps steady. The revolver waited inside. His hand itched to close around it. It was time. Inside the cabin, David moved with precise efficiency. He retrieved the revolver from beneath his folded clothes, checked the cylinder to confirm it was loaded, and slid it into the back waistband of his jeans. He paused for a moment by the door, listening to the faint sounds of the wind off the lake. The weight of what he was about to do pressed against his chest, not regret, but a heavy mechanical sense of inevitability. There was no way back, only through. David walked slowly down the gravel path toward the shoreline, the gun hidden beneath his jacket. Marissa stood at the water's edge, her arms wrapped around herself, shivering slightly in the cool night air. She turned as she heard his footsteps, smiling softly. "You brought the blanket?" she asked, her voice hopeful, fragile. David nodded once. "Come here." She moved toward him, her eyes shining in the low moonlight. For a fleeting moment, David almost saw the woman he had once loved, the woman who had smiled at him across hospital waiting rooms, who had danced barefoot in their kitchen. But that woman was gone. She had chosen a different path, and now both of them would walk the one he had laid out. David drew the revolver with one smooth, practiced motion. Marissa's eyes widened. She froze mid-step, confusion flashing first, then fear. "David?" she whispered. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer. He simply raised the gun and leveled it at her chest. Tears welled in her eyes instantly. "Please, please no. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." David's hand tightened on the grip. His voice was eerily calm. "Sorry doesn't change anything." Marissa dropped to her knees in the dirt, sobbing now, begging, a flood of desperate words tumbling out, promises, regrets, bargains. She held up her hands as if to shield herself, as if mere flesh and bone could stop what was coming. David didn't shout. He didn't rage. He simply pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed across the lake, sharp and final. Marissa crumpled instantly, falling onto her side in the dirt. David stood over her, breathing hard, the revolver still aimed at her unmoving body. He waited. 5 seconds, 10, but she didn't stir. A dark stain spread beneath her, soaking into the earth. Silence returned, vast and smothering. For a long moment, David simply stood there, gun hanging at his side, staring down at the woman who had once been the center of his life. In that moment, there was no satisfaction, no catharsis, only a deep, cold emptiness that even violence couldn't fill. The realization struck him harder than the recoil of the gun. Nothing would ever be enough to erase what had been done to him. Not even this. Slowly, he turned back toward the cabin. He needed to think, needed to plan. His badge, his reputation, his years of service. All of it meant nothing now. He was a criminal, a murderer twice over. But survival instinct still pulsed through him. If he was going to go down, he wouldn't make it easy. He slipped the revolver back into his waistband and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Marissa's body cooling by the lake. David returned to the cabin, the door creaking softly as he pushed it open. The fire had burned down to a soft glow, casting long, uncertain shadows across the room. He moved quickly but deliberately, wiping down surfaces with a rag, careful to remove any prints that would suggest a premeditated plan. He packed lightly, only the essentials. No sign of the revolver. No personal items left behind that could be tied specifically to this night. He placed the half-finished groceries into the trash, leaving the cabin to look abandoned, as if a couple had arrived, fought, and left in haste. Before stepping back into the night, David took one last look around. It was almost convincing. Almost. He drove back toward Crestwood under the cover of darkness, taking back roads to avoid cameras and traffic. He kept his hands steady on the wheel, his breathing even, the night folding around him like a cocoon. As he neared the town limits, he pulled off the road into a dense patch of woods and buried the revolver, digging a hole nearly 2 feet deep. It was unlikely anyone would stumble across it, but even if they did, without the weapon on him, it would at least complicate the chain of evidence. When he finally arrived home, the familiar sight of their modest house sat heavy on his chest. Without Marissa's car in the driveway, it looked strangely hollow, like a stage set after the actors had gone. He entered quietly, showered methodically, scrubbing his hands until the skin turned red and raw. He burned the clothes he had worn at the cabin in the rusted barrel behind the garage, watching the smoke curl into the night sky. David barely slept. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the world to start asking questions. It didn't take long. By mid-morning, Deputy Weller was at his doorstep. David greeted him with a practiced grimace of confusion. "Hey, Sheriff," Weller said, shifting awkwardly. "We got a call from Pine Hollow Security. Some hikers found a body by the lake this morning. Female. Looks like Marissa." David's heart thudded against his ribs, but he kept his expression locked in place. Horror, disbelief, grief, all carefully measured. "I'll come down there," he said, his voice cracking slightly. The drive back to the lake was a surreal echo of the night before, only now the road buzzed with patrol cars and flashing lights. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze. David parked, squared his shoulders, and walked toward the perimeter, where a deputy lifted the tape for him. He approached the body slowly. Marissa's form lay partially covered by a tarp, but he could still see her hand. Small, pale, frozen mid-reach, as if she had been calling for someone. He swallowed hard, forcing a tremor into his hand as he knelt beside the sheet. "That's my wife," he whispered hoarsely. Deputy Weller placed a hand on his shoulder, steady and sympathetic. "We're going to find out who did this, Sheriff. I swear to you." David nodded, keeping his face hidden. Inside, the realization was sinking deeper. Surviving this would be harder than he thought. Already, investigators were fanning out, photographing footprints, taking soil samples, asking questions. Every second they spent here increased the chances they'd find something, anything, to unravel the story David had so carefully constructed. The clock had started ticking. The crime scene quickly evolved into a coordinated machine. Forensics teams began combing the area, marking footprints, cataloging tire tracks, collecting soil samples. Detective Aaron Briggs from the county was called in to oversee the homicide investigation, a man David respected but never particularly liked for his relentless attention to detail. Standing among his own deputies, David found himself in an unfamiliar position, the subject of sympathy and scrutiny at once. He played the part of the devastated husband convincingly, answering questions with just the right amount of hesitation, letting his voice crack at opportune moments. He told them the story he had crafted. Marissa had wanted a weekend to reconnect. They drove to the cabin. She had gone down to the lake alone to get some air while he cleaned up inside. When she didn't come back, he assumed she was taking time. He fell asleep waiting for her, and when he woke up around dawn and realized she hadn't returned, he panicked and started searching, but found nothing. He thought maybe she had walked to the nearest road for help, maybe fallen. By morning, when there was still no sign, he returned to town to get help. It was simple, human, fallible, believable, he hoped. Detective Briggs nodded slowly but said little. His sharp eyes missed nothing. "We'll need you to formally sit for a statement, Sheriff," Briggs said. "Just procedure." "Of course," David replied, his hands folded tightly in front of him to hide the slight tremor. By midday, the first hint of complications surfaced. A crime scene tech approached Briggs, holding a small evidence bag containing a broken gold bracelet. "Found this near the tree line," the tech said. "Looks fresh. Could belong to the Vic, but it's snapped. Might suggest a struggle." David's stomach clenched. Marissa must have been wearing it, one he hadn't noticed, one he hadn't accounted for. Briggs turned it over in his hand, frowning. "We'll check it for prints, and we'll need to canvass the area. Check with the rental cabins, security cameras, any hunters or fishermen who might have been nearby." David forced a nod of agreement. Inside, cold dread prickled at the base of his neck. That night, back home, David sat alone in the kitchen nursing a glass of whiskey, the knot of fear tightening with every passing hour. His mind replayed every step, every detail. Had he left more behind? Had someone seen something? To complicate matters, word reached him that morning that Eric Sloane's body had officially been identified. Local news ran back-to-back reports about the unrelated murders: a personal trainer killed in a robbery, a sheriff's wife murdered during a romantic getaway, 2 dead, 2 different investigations. But David knew it was only a matter of time before the wrong person started connecting the dots. Already he could feel it, the subtle shift in how people looked at him, a little too sympathetic, a little too curious. The weight of 2 bodies pressed down harder. The following morning, David was summoned to the sheriff's department for a formal interview. Not in his office, but in one of the neutral conference rooms usually reserved for suspects and witnesses. The message was clear. Optics mattered now. Briggs wasn't going to let sentiment cloud the process. David dressed carefully, wearing a somber dark suit and a tired expression. He rehearsed his story over and over in his mind as he drove, adjusting small details to account for anything the investigators might have uncovered overnight. Inside the conference room, a tape recorder clicked on. Briggs sat across from him, a legal pad open in front of him, a steaming cup of black coffee by his elbow. "We're recording, just for the record," Briggs said casually. "Standard procedure." David nodded, folding his hands on the table. The questions started simple: timelines, feelings, descriptions of Marissa's mood that weekend. David answered smoothly, the grief in his voice manufactured but convincing. But slowly the questions sharpened. "Sheriff, is there any chance you and Marissa argued that night?" Briggs asked, not looking up from his notes. David shook his head, letting a tremor creep into his voice. "No, we were trying to fix things." Briggs nodded slowly, scribbling something down. "And you said you fell asleep waiting for her. Didn't hear anything unusual? No gunshots? No struggle?" "No, I thought she was just taking time. I didn't know anything was wrong until I woke up." Another long pause. Briggs tapped his pen against the pad. "Funny thing," he said, almost offhand. "We talked to the neighbors near the cabins. One of them swears they heard a gunshot around midnight." David's stomach twisted, but he kept his expression locked. "It's a lake," he said quietly. "Sound travel's weird. Could have been hunters, a car backfiring." Briggs smiled thinly. "Could be." The interview ended after an hour, but David could feel the shift, a barely perceptible cooling. Briggs wasn't accusing him, not yet, but he was circling. Later that afternoon, another crack appeared. Deputy Weller approached him at the station, hesitant. "Sheriff, listen, something else came up." David forced a neutral expression. "Go on." "Eric Sloane, the guy found dead a few days ago? Turns out he had some, connections to Marissa. A couple of witnesses say they saw him with her a few times. Gym buddies, maybe more." David's pulse thundered in his ears. "We're gonna have to pull Marissa's phone records," Weller continued, looking genuinely uncomfortable. "Briggs' orders. See if there's anything that ties back." David nodded stiffly, his mind racing. If they pulled her phone, if they found her texts to Eric, the meeting at the motel, anything, it would open doors he couldn't close. It was happening faster than he anticipated. That evening, David sat alone in his study, staring at the dark window. The storm he had unleashed was now fully rolling toward him. It was no longer a question of if they would figure it out. It was only a question of when. The following day brought the first tangible blow. Forensics completed a preliminary analysis of Marissa's phone records. A series of messages between her and Eric Sloan revealed more than casual friendship, affectionate texts, plans to meet at the motel. The messages ended abruptly the night both were killed. Detective Briggs requested a private meeting with David. In the same neutral conference room, Briggs laid out the evidence calmly, without accusation. "Found this interesting," Briggs said, sliding a printout of text messages across the table. David stared at the paper, reading the obvious intimacy in the messages, undeniable proof of Marissa's ongoing affair. Briggs leaned back. "Doesn't look great. 2 people involved with each other. Both end up dead within days." David kept his hands folded tightly to hide the sweat slicking his palms. "I had no idea she was still seeing him," he said, voice hoarse with manufactured hurt. Briggs watched him for a long beat, then nodded. "We believe you, Sheriff, but appearances matter. We have to follow all leads." David forced a grim nod, playing the role of the grieving, betrayed husband, but he felt the walls closing in. That afternoon, an even worse discovery came to light. Deputies searching the woods near the cabin found a set of shallow boot prints leading away from the lakeshore, prints consistent with David's size and tread pattern from his department-issued hiking boots. A small detail, but one that didn't fit his story of falling asleep inside. When Weller brought him the news, David kept his expression neutral, but inside, panic gnawed at him. "You were the last one with her, Sheriff," Weller said quietly. "We gotta account for every minute." David excused himself, locking the bathroom door behind him and gripping the sink tightly. His reflection stared back at him, drawn and haggard. He was losing control. Back at home that evening, David sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, making frantic lists, possible witnesses, evidence still unaccounted for, explanations he could offer for the boot prints, for the timing of the gunshots. But it was no use. The problem wasn't a single piece of evidence. It was the totality, the way the small cracks were forming a roadmap directly to him. He hadn't just underestimated the investigators, he had underestimated how much of himself he had left behind. By nightfall, David received a terse call from Briggs. They would be issuing a warrant to search his home and property the next morning. "Just routine," Briggs said. But David knew better. Tomorrow, they wouldn't be treating him like a grieving husband anymore. They would be treating him like a suspect. Morning broke under a low, heavy sky as David sat in his kitchen motionless. His sidearm rested on the table, next to the badge that once represented everything he had built. When the convoy of unmarked cars pulled into his driveway, David didn't react. He watched through the window as Detective Briggs climbed out, flanked by deputies he had trained, trusted, and once led. There was no point in running. Nowhere to go. A heavy knock rattled the front door. Briggs called out, "Sheriff Holt, we have a warrant." David opened the door calmly, stepping back with his hands visible. For a moment, there was an almost imperceptible flicker of recognition between him and Briggs, 2 men who understood that a line had been crossed long ago and there was no coming back. Deputies swept the house methodically. In David's study, they found inconsistencies. Paperwork related to the cabin rental, maps with handwritten notes, inconsistencies in time logs he had submitted. In the backyard, near the old garage, a deputy flagged something. Sifting through the soil, they uncovered burned fabric remains, scraps of denim, melted rubber soles. Analysis would later confirm these to be remnants of the clothing David wore the night Marissa was killed. Inside, Briggs faced David across the living room. "I need you to come with us, David," he said, voice low, almost regretful. David nodded once, the final resignation sinking into his bones. No fight, no pleas. Cuffs clicked coldly around his wrists, an irony he could appreciate in the detached corner of his mind. At the station, David was booked like any other suspect, fingerprinted, mugshotted, stripped of the shield that had once protected him. In the interrogation room, faced with the overwhelming evidence, David finally spoke. "I loved her," he said quietly. "But she killed me first." Briggs said nothing, only slid a legal pad across the table. David signed the confession without hesitation, detailing the discovery of his HIV diagnosis, the betrayal, the calculated killings of both Eric Sloan and Marissa. There was no grand speech, no drama, only the mechanical recounting of a man who had once embodied justice and now stood as its most bitter violation. The trial, when it came, was swift. David was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. His former colleagues testified about his behavior in the weeks leading up to the deaths. Forensic evidence, the boot prints, burned clothes, ballistic matches to Marissa's and Eric's bodies, painted a picture too clear to deny. David's defense attempted to argue diminished capacity, citing the emotional devastation of the HIV diagnosis and betrayal, but the jury needed less than 6 hours to reach a verdict, guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the judge spoke with cold finality. "You, Sheriff Holt, were entrusted with the law. Instead, you weaponized it. You betrayed not only your oath but every person who ever looked to you for protection." David was sentenced to life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole. As he was led away, he didn't look back. In Crestwood, life moved forward, but the scars remained. A town that had once trusted a man to enforce the law would now always remember the price of that misplaced faith. And in the cold, gray confines of a state penitentiary, David Holt lived out his final years, a man imprisoned long before the cell door ever closed.